"You're faking it, sir. There's nothing wrong with you." The words hit Hal Morgan like a slap across the face. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. Just looked at the young doctor, eyes steady, jaw clenched like he had on nights when bullets tore the air in Kandahar. Then with slow hands, he placed a worn dust-covered envelope on the examination table. Inside an X-ray from a battlefield hospital in Iraq, everything stopped. His son, a VA nurse, leaned forward and said quietly, "Now do you believe him?" The room fell silent, and in that silence something shifted. This is the story of Hal Morgan, the pain he carried, and the system that had to be forced to listen. His name is Harold Morgan, but everyone who knows him simply calls him Hal. At 70 years old, Hal's presence still commands quiet respect. He's not the kind of man who raises his voice to be heard. He never needed to. A straight-back, steel-eyed reminder of another era, Hal walks through life with the calm discipline of a soldier who's seen too much and talks about very little. Hal served 35 years in the United States Army, most of it spent not in offices or briefings, but boots and mud dust in his lungs and sun on his shoulders. He enlisted in 1972 when the war in Vietnam was already turning sour. He wasn't drafted, he signed up willingly, following in the footsteps of his father, who served in Korea, and his grandfather, who stormed the beaches at Normandy. For the Morgan service wasn't just a duty, it was a tradition stitched into the very fabric of their bloodline. Vietnam hardened him early. He saw things most young men wouldn't survive mentally, let alone physically. But Hal didn't break. He adapted. He learned. And eventually, he became the man others followed. After multiple combat tours, Hal transitioned into a stateside role training younger recruits. Some of the best soldiers to serve in the Gulf and early Iraq wars were once wide-eyed teenagers who learned how to survive under Hal Morgan's no-nonsense instruction. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't friendly, but he was honest, sharp, and unshakably loyal to the men and women under his guidance. After retiring as a command sergeant, Major Hal didn't chase medals or public praise. He returned to his roots, an old family farm in rural Indiana. There in a quiet corner of the state where the nights are silent and the cornfields stretch to the horizon. Hal built a life of peace with his wife of 45 years, June. They raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, each of whom grew up with the quiet understanding that their father was someone others once called Sir, even when he wasn't looking. Hal was the kind of father who fixed fences without being asked and built wooden toys in the barn when money was tight. He never talked about what he saw overseas unless it was in the form of a lesson, a warning, or a teachable moment. And even then it was brief, just enough to understand the cost, never enough to dwell on it. He's the kind of man who holds the pain inside because that's what soldiers do. Or at least that's what they were taught to do. But time has a way of wearing down even the strongest, and in the stillness of retirement, a new kind of battle emerged, one not against enemies in the jungle or desert, but against a system that looked at men like Hal and saw only age, not sacrifice. This is where his story begins, not on a battlefield, but in a hospital waiting room where his word is questioned for the first time, and silence is no longer an option. It started with a numb ache in Hal Morgan's lower back, not sharp at first, just enough to slow his mornings. He thought little of it. Pain was nothing new to him. He'd slept on desert rocks and bunker floors for decades, hiked miles under a 90-pound rucksack, and carried wounded soldiers through mud and blood without stopping to check his own injuries. His body had always been a tool, not a temple. Tools get worn. That's life. But this pain didn't go away. By the time he turned 70, the numb ache had turned into lightning bolts that shot down his right leg every time he stepped off his porch. Some days he couldn't make it to the barn without gripping the railing like a lifeline. On worse mornings, he used a wooden cane, one he carved himself years ago mostly for decoration. Now it was his third leg. His wife, June, insisted he see someone. She had watched her strong, stoic husband grit his teeth through meals, lean against counters when he thought no one was watching, and wake up gasping at night. "You've given this country more than enough," she told him. "Let them take care of you now." So Hal made an appointment at the nearest civilian hospital, Fort Field Regional, a modest facility 20 miles from the farm. It wasn't a VA clinic, but he didn't want the hassle of long waits or distant drives. He just wanted someone to listen. But from the moment he walked in, Hal could feel it, that subtle look in the receptionist's eyes, the polite but rushed tone, the kind of vibe that says you're just another old man complaining about your joints. The doctor assigned to his case was Dr. Ethan Klein, a clean-cut man in his early 30s with crisp scrubs, expensive shoes, and the clipped confidence of someone who had never fought for anything but good grades. His office was modern, his walls decorated with framed degrees from top-tier universities, and his smile felt practiced like something he learned in a patient empathy seminar. At their first meeting, Dr. Klein flipped casually through Hal's intake notes, not even looking up when he spoke. Back pain, stiffness, leg, numbness. Well, you're 70, Mr. Morgan. That's to be expected. Hal sat on the exam table, shoulders square, hands folded over his knees. It's more than stiffness, Doc, he said. I can barely stand for 10 minutes. Can't lift. Can't sleep. Dr. Klein glanced up finally. Well, you don't look like you're in that much pain. Let's get some standard x-rays checked for arthritis or disc wear. But my bet it's just age. Happens to all of us. Hal's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm. I've lived with pain before. I know what it feels like. This is different. Dr. Klein smiled faintly dismissively. Sure, but pain is subjective. Nothing on your chart suggests anything serious. Frankly, it's probably just arthritis or chronic stiffness. You need movement, not medication. Walk it off. Stay active. Walk it off. That phrase hit Hal harder than any diagnosis. It echoed like a cruel joke. He'd walked through jungles with malaria. Walked through blown-out streets in Mosul, dragging two privates behind cover. Walked miles through sandstorms and sniper fire because no one else could. He'd walked it off for 35 years, but now he could barely make it to the mailbox. What hurt more than the pain was being looked at like a crank, like a tired relic of a war nobody talks about anymore. To Dr. Klein, he wasn't a warrior, a mentor, or a survivor. He was a 70-year-old man with a stubborn spine and a history too long to skim. Hal left the appointment without answers. No treatment plan, no referrals, just a printed sheet suggesting yoga, vitamin D, and more walking. As he climbed into his truck, wincing with every movement, something inside him twisted not just pain, but humiliation. For the first time in his life, Hal Morgan felt invisible, and that more than any wound was unbearable. Hal Morgan never liked to complain. It just wasn't how he was raised. His father, Richard Morgan, was a World War II veteran who spent 7 months in a German POW camp. The man came home half the weight he left with and never once spoke about what happened behind those barbed wire fences. When Hal was a boy, he once saw his father wince from an old shrapnel wound while stacking firewood. When he asked if he was okay, his dad just said, "If I can talk about it, I can work through it." That's the code Hal lived by. So even now, waking up each morning with a back so stiff he could barely sit up a leg that went numb halfway to the kitchen. Hal kept quiet. He'd grip the bedpost, pull himself upright, swallow the groan, and get moving before June noticed. But of course, she always noticed. June Morgan had been with Hal since before his first deployment. She knew every line in his face, every pause in his breath, and every time he said, "I'm fine," when he clearly wasn't. Lately, the lies had become harder to ignore. She'd find him leaning against the wall when he thought no one was looking, his hand pressing into his hip like he was holding something together. The cane he once joked was just for show had become a necessity. "Al," she said one morning, standing in the doorway as he sat on the edge of the bed motionless. "This isn't stubbornness anymore. This is suffering." He didn't look at her. "I've had worse. That's not the point." Their daughter Sarah, a trauma nurse in Indianapolis, visited that weekend. She watched her father try and fail to get off the porch swing without bracing himself like he was preparing for impact. She bit her tongue until he made it inside, then cornered her mother in the kitchen. "This isn't normal aging, Mom. He's guarding something, he's compensating for pain. That leg's not just stiff, it's partially dead. You know how many men his age I've seen with spinal injuries that went ignored for decades? By the time they speak up, it's permanent." June nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she dried a dish. "He won't let it stop him. That's what scares me." That night, Hal sat alone in the barn with a mug of coffee gone cold. The smell of hay and oil filled the air. He stared at a faded photo nailed above his workbench, 4 soldiers in desert camouflage smiling in front of a Humvee, sand kicking up around their boots. One of them, Private First Class Alan Rhodes, was 19 at the time. Bright red hair, nervous smile. fresh out of Georgia. That kid never should have been there. Hal remembered the moment like it was yesterday, 1991, northern Kuwait toward the tail end of the Gulf War. Their convoy hit an IED. The vehicle went up in flames. Allen was thrown 30 feet, legs shredded, unconscious. The rest of the team was pinned down by sporadic gunfire from a nearby ridge. No medevac, no backup, just chaos and dust. Hal didn't think. He moved, threw Allen over his shoulder, adjusted the weight, and started walking. 5 miles, through heat that burned his skin under his armor. Every step a gamble, every second exposed. The bullets snapped past him like hornets. He didn't stop, not once. Allen survived. Hal never got checked out. There wasn't time. But now, 30 years later, his body was screaming for the attention he never gave it back then. The weight he carried that day didn't just bruise his back, it altered it forever. Vertebrae compressed, nerves twisted, and no one had looked close enough to see. Until now, he hadn't even looked himself. But deep down, Hal knew the truth. He wasn't dealing with aging. He was dealing with damage. And the cracks, emotional and physical, were spreading faster than he could patch them. The pain was bad, but the system that was worse. Hal Morgan had always figured that, when the day came, he couldn't carry himself anymore. The country he'd carried for decades would be there for him. He didn't expect red carpets or grand ceremonies, just honesty, a good doctor, and a straight answer. What he got instead was waiting rooms, paperwork, and quiet indifference. Fort Field Regional sent him home with a pamphlet about healthy aging. He tried calling to ask for a second opinion, only to be told he'd need to schedule another appointment in 3 weeks. Meanwhile, every movement felt like fire slicing through his spine. Simple tasks like bending to tie his boots or driving the tractor were now calculated risks. Then came the bills. X-rays, consults, lab tests, none of it cheap. Medicare only covered a portion. The rest landed in his mailbox like a second injury. Hal had always prided himself on staying debt-free. Even when he came back from deployments with nothing but sand in his pockets, he always paid his way. Now he was staring at envelopes marked past due for tests that gave him no answers. And then there were the phone calls being put on hold, transferred, asked to try another department. The hospital staff didn't seem rude, just distracted, detached. To them, he was patient 7483B, date of birth, height, weight, a man with a cane and no visible wound. But Hal knew what the real problem was. They didn't understand what combat trauma does to a body. Not the kind of trauma that comes from a bullet or shrapnel, but the trauma that accumulates over years, over missions, over choices. Civilian doctors, for all their degrees, had never carried a rucksack through enemy territory or dragged a bleeding soldier across a minefield. They didn't understand what wear and tear looked like when it came in the form of heroism. One Thursday evening, after June found Hal gripping the kitchen counter mid-spasm, she called their son. Tom Morgan had followed his father's footsteps, but in his own way. He'd served 2 tours with the Marines in Afghanistan before transitioning into nursing. Now he worked at the VA hospital in Chicago, coordinating care for wounded veterans and overseeing rehabilitation programs. When he answered the call, he heard the tension in his mother's voice and the silence behind her. "Put Dad on," he said. Hal took the phone reluctantly. "I'm fine," he muttered. "No, you're not," Tom replied. "And don't tell me to walk it off. I know that move. I learned it from you." There was a pause then, a quieter voice. "They think I'm faking it." Tom exhaled slowly. "Dad, listen to me. These civilian hospitals don't know what they're looking for. They don't know how to read service injuries, especially ones like yours, old, layered, masked by years of adapting. You could have spinal trauma, and they'd call it arthritis." "So what am I supposed to do?" Hal asked, his voice cracking for the first time in months. "Get your records, all of them, from boot camp to retirement. I need every injury report, every field evaluation, every scrap of paper they ever filed on you. Once we have that, I'll walk it into the VA myself. They won't believe you unless you show them proof." That word stuck with Hal, proof. For 35 years, his word had been enough to lead men into hell and back. Now it wasn't enough to get a second opinion. That wasn't just frustrating, it was humiliating. But Hal wasn't the kind to fold. If the system needed proof, then he'd find it. He might be slower than he used to be, But he still had one thing on his side: that bureaucracy never counted on determination. And so began his second war, not against a foreign enemy, but against the silence and red tape of a country he'd once risked everything to defend. It started with a phone call and a list. Tom had emailed it that same night, a rundown of every document Hal would need: service records, combat evaluations, medical charts, incident reports, after-action memos, anything that could trace Payne back to the battlefield. Hal printed it out and pinned it to the wall above his desk in the barn, next to a faded American flag and a rusting horseshoe. Then he got to work. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, request forms, and long hours spent waiting on hold. The Department of the Army, the VA's records office, the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. He spoke to so many strangers that their voices started to blend together, helpful, polite, but buried under 1,000 other requests. Some files came quickly: his enlistment papers, training certifications, and a decade's worth of fitness reports. But the deeper he dug, the more scattered things became. Wars don't leave neat files. They leave chaos. One afternoon, June found him sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by manila folders and crumpled coffee filters. "What are you looking for?" she asked gently. "Proof," he said, not looking up. "Proof that I didn't make this up, that I earned every bit of this pain." He kept digging, and then he remembered the attic. The box had been there for years, shoved behind old Christmas decorations and a broken fan. He'd almost forgotten it existed. It was a military-issue field storage chest, dented at the corners, its latch rusted but intact. Inside, he found the scent of old paper salt and something else: time itself, compressed and forgotten. There were stacks of old notebooks, a few medals still in their velvet cases, and folded letters from a younger June, written in cursive ink on yellowing stationery. Underneath, he found what he hadn't even realized: he was looking for: a thick brown envelope marked with a faded red cross. Inside were the field x-rays taken after the 1991 ambush in the Gulf. He remembered now, after carrying private roads through 5 miles of hostile territory, Hal had been rushed to a forward operating post. The medics checked his vitals, gave him fluids, and shot a few x-rays to make sure he hadn't cracked anything. He had waved them off at the time, saying he was fine. They believed him. But the images told a different story. He held them up to the attic light, dim, dusty, barely enough to see. Even to his untrained eye, the damage was visible: compressed vertebrae, a slight tilt in the lower spine, the outline of stress that had gone untreated, unnoticed, and unhealed. He stared at the film for a long time. Underneath the x-rays were 2 carbon copy field reports, one written by the attending medic, the other by Hal himself. Both mentioned the physical strain and trauma from the incident. Both described the pain in his back and right leg. But neither recommended follow-up care beyond rest and hydration. And in wartime, rest was a luxury few could afford. It hit Hal like a wave. How many times had he pushed through something like this? How many injuries had been minimized, brushed aside, documented and forgotten? He gathered everything: the x-rays, the field notes, the injury reports. He placed them neatly in a clean envelope and labeled it in black ink: medical evidence, 1991. Back downstairs, he laid the documents out across the dining table, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was holding. June sat beside him, silent. There were no words needed. The proof was there. It had always been there, buried not in memory but in bureaucracy. And now it was time to be heard. Hal Morgan had walked into combat zones without backup. He'd led soldiers through smoke and sand, with bullets snapping inches from his ears. But walking back into that hospital, civilian, sterile, indifferent, felt harder than all of it. This time he wasn't alone. Tom drove in from Chicago that morning wearing his VA badge clipped to his belt and a stack of printed records under his arm. Beside him sat Rudy Alvarez, Hal's old squad mate from the Gulf, now a physician's assistant at a military rehab clinic. The last time the three of them had been in the same room, it had been a field hospital in Kuwait, soaked in sweat, adrenaline, and blood. They stepped into Fort Field Regional together, cutting through the waiting room like a quiet front line. Hal led the way, no cane this time. Just the manila envelope under his arm and a jaw set like granite. When the nurse called his name, Dr. Ethan Klein was already waiting in the exam room, tapping away at his tablet. He barely looked up. "Mr. Morgan." "Back again." Hal didn't respond. He set the envelope down on the table like he was placing evidence before a jury. Tom spoke first. His tone was calm, measured, but firm. Dr. Klein, I'm Tom Morgan, VA clinical nurse. This is my father. I've reviewed his entire military medical file, including diagnostics taken during and after the 1991 Gulf conflict. What you missed wasn't age-related degeneration, it was a combat injury. Klein blinked, then looked at the third man entering the room. Rudy Alvarez. Rudy said, offering a curt nod. Physician assistant, former Army combat medic. Hal and I served together. He carried me 5 miles under enemy fire after an ambush in northern Kuwait. I was unconscious. He saved my life. Dr. Klein's posture shifted slightly, but he didn't speak. Tom opened the envelope and laid out a series of documents, photocopies of military reports, typed evaluations, and finally the aged X-ray films Hal had recovered from the attic. These were taken within hours of the ambush, Tom said, pointing. Look at the L3 and L4 vertebrae. Compression, slight misalignment, and residual damage consistent with carrying high loads under extreme conditions. Klein took the X-rays reluctantly. His eyes narrowed. He reached for the recent digital scans from 6 months ago, the ones he had brushed off. Rudy stepped closer and tapped the older film. You ever carry 200 pounds of dead weight, Doc? He asked. In full gear across sand dunes with dehydration, adrenaline, and heat stroke creeping in, Dr. Klein didn't answer. Rudy leaned in just slightly. That kind of stress doesn't show up right away. It burrows into joints, into nerves, into the soft tissue. And it doesn't go away when the war ends. It sits there and it waits. For years, decades. Until one day the body just says, enough. Klein studied the film in silence. His face changed, first skepticism, then uncertainty, then something that looked like shame. Hal said nothing. He didn't need to. The documents, the men beside him, and the proof laid out on the table all spoke louder than words. Finally, Klein looked up. I missed it, he admitted, voice lower now. I was looking for acute trauma, not this. Hal gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. Now you've seen it. The room went still. Tom stepped forward and tapped the X-ray. You didn't just miss an injury, Doctor. You dismissed a man. Klein lowered his gaze. I owe you an apology, Mr. Morgan. You weren't faking. You were carrying more than I knew. Hal took a breath. It wasn't victory, he felt, but recognition. And after months of silence, disbelief, and pain, that was enough to finally begin healing. Dr. Ethan Klein sat at his desk long after Hal Morgan and the others had left the examination room. The VA certified records remained spread before him like a battlefield map, and for the first time in his short career, he felt the kind of weight they never warned about in medical school. He hadn't just misread a chart, he had misjudged a man. The spinal compression was obvious now. The old X-rays, yellowed with age, revealed what the newer images only hinted at: vertebrae pushed inward, the slight rotation of a lower disc, scarring patterns consistent with chronic trauma. The damage wasn't just physical, it was the legacy of sacrifice, the kind of sacrifice Klein had never truly understood until today. In his mind, the words came back to haunt him. Walk it off. It's just old age. There's nothing wrong with you. Now faced with military documents, eyewitness testimony, and the unwavering presence of a man who had carried both people and pain longer than Klein had been alive, the truth hit him hard. He'd failed, and he knew he wasn't the only one. That week, Dr. Klein requested a meeting with the hospital's chief of staff. He didn't deflect or downplay what had happened. Instead, he laid out Hal's case in full detail, his initial assumptions, the overlooked indicators, and how civilian medicine often fails to account for the long-term damage of military service. Combat injuries, he told them, aren't always dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet, lingering. They're hidden behind decades of silence and toughness. And if we're not looking for them, we won't see them. The conversation led to something rare in healthcare, a genuine pause, a willingness to look inward. Within days, Fort Field Regional launched a formal internal review of its veteran patient protocols. A committee was formed to reevaluate how intake forms handled military history. Doctors and nurses across the facility were invited, some mandated to undergo new training seminars focused on understanding chronic combat trauma, how it differs from age-related conditions, and why many veterans minimize their symptoms. Hal's case became a teaching module. Without names or identifiers, his story was used to walk other doctors through how misdiagnosis happens, not because of incompetence, but because of blind spots in perspective. Because when you've never worn combat boots or hauled a bleeding man across a minefield, you don't always see the cost written in someone's posture or gait. For Dr. Klein, the moment became more than professional embarrassment, it became a personal reckoning. He began reaching out to VA centers asking to shadow veteran-focused physicians. He wanted to understand, not just correct. As for Hal, the pain didn't vanish, but it finally had a name and a cause. His condition was diagnosed as chronic spinal compression with degenerative nerve impact stemming directly from untreated wartime trauma. With that diagnosis came access to targeted therapy, pain management, and full VA coverage, and most importantly, validation. For years, Hal had carried the burden quietly, shouldering pain with the same stoicism he once carried soldiers through fire. Now, for the first time, the world looked back at him, not with pity, but with understanding. The system had heard him, and it had begun to change. Hal Morgan didn't expect a parade. He wasn't looking for praise. All he wanted after years of silence and misdiagnosis was to be treated like he mattered. And for the first time in months, he finally was. Following his confrontation with Dr. Klein and the presentation of his military medical records, Hal was immediately referred to a VA care coordinator. Within days, he was enrolled in a full-service veteran treatment plan covering pain management, spinal rehabilitation, and weekly physical therapy sessions tailored to long-term combat-related trauma. The appointments didn't erase the damage, but they made it manageable. He could walk longer, sleep better, and breathe through a day without the constant undercurrent of burning pain. More than that, Hal felt seen. Every session was now handled by someone who understood what it meant to carry invisible wounds. The VA doctors didn't ask dismissive questions. They didn't assume. They listened. And that to Hal made all the difference. But his recovery wasn't just personal. Word of Hal's case quiet at first began to ripple through the hospital community. 1 week later, a Vietnam-era Marine came in clutching a decades-old X-ray of his own, inspired by what he'd heard in the waiting room. The next week, it was a Gulf War medic with untreated shrapnel near his spine. One by one, older veterans began coming forward, men and women who had lived for years with pain that had been minimized, ignored, or misread. Each of them had a version of Hal's story. Each of them was finally getting a second look. In response, Fort Field Regional moved quickly. They worked with local VA representatives and veteran organizations to implement formal veteran treatment protocols. Intake forms were redesigned to ask about military service up front. A new flagging system was introduced in patient charts to alert doctors of possible service-related complications. Staff underwent specialized training on identifying and addressing chronic injuries rooted in combat conditions, even ones that didn't show up clearly on modern scans. And then came the moment no one expected. Dr. Ethan Klein, once known for his sharp confidence and quick diagnoses, stood up at a public town hall forum on veterans' health hosted by the county. The event was meant to educate the public, but Dr. Klein made it something more. "I made a mistake," he told the crowd. "I saw an old man with pain and assumed it was age. I dismissed his story. What I didn't see, what I failed to see, was the war he still carried in his bones." There was a long silence after he spoke, but it wasn't judgment that followed, it was applause. Hal sat in the back of the room with June beside him watching. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just listened, grateful that the system was beginning in small steps to correct itself. The change wouldn't be immediate. It wouldn't reach everyone. But it was a start, and it started with one man refusing to stay silent. Hal Morgan's story isn't just about back pain or military service, or a dusty envelope with an old X-ray. It's about something bigger, something all of us face at some point in our lives. The feeling of being overlooked, of speaking and not being heard, of carrying something heavy while everyone else walks right by. In Hal's case, it was a spinal injury from war. In yours, it might be grief, loneliness, or a memory no one else understands. We live in a country that celebrates freedom, but too often we forget the cost of it. Not just the lives lost in combat, but the lives still being lived quietly among us by veterans, caregivers, and elders who feel left behind by a system that moves too fast and listens too little. This story reminds us that listening is an act of respect. And believing someone's pain, even when it's invisible, is an act of love. So we ask you, have you ever felt unheard? Do you think today's healthcare system truly understands what older Americans and veterans go through? What would you tell someone younger who thinks they know more just because they read it in a book? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the one someone else needed to hear. And if Hal's story meant something to you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life, please click like, subscribe, and share this video with your family, your friends, or your veteran community. Because respect shouldn't have to be earned twice. And sometimes the most patriotic thing we can do is listen better. Thank you for spending time with us. And to every veteran watching, seen or unseen, you are not forgotten. Not here, not ever.